Today, we're talking about a story that feels like it's ripped straight out of a Tom Clancy novel, but it's actually unfolding right now, in the first weeks of 2026. On January 3rd, the world woke up to a seismic shift. U.S. forces captured Nicolas Maduro in Caracas during Operation Absolute Resolve. Regardless of where you stand on the politics, the ripple effects aren't just happening in government buildings. They're happening at your local gas station and in the deepest corners of the global energy markets. President Trump has made it very clear. He wants to fix up Venezuela's oil. He's talking about a massive $100 billion investment, bringing in big oil to rebuild a shattered industry, and effectively bringing the world's largest oil reserves under a new American-led sphere of influence. But here's the big question. Can you actually flip a switch on a country that has been falling apart for 20 years? Is this the end of OPEC's dominance? Or is it a multi-billion-dollar gamble that might take a decade to pay off? We're going to look at the energy dominance strategy, the secret struggle with China over these barrels, and the cold, hard reality of the heavy crude that Venezuela is famous for. To understand why this is happening now, you have to look at the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The administration isn't just looking at this as a regime change. They're calling it energy dominance. Venezuela sits on roughly 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. To put that in perspective, that's more than Saudi Arabia. It's about 17% of the entire planet's known oil supply. But for the last few years, because of mismanagement and sanctions, they've been producing less than 1% of the world's supply. It's like having a Ferrari in the garage, but the engine is rusted shut and you've lost the keys. The Trump strategy is to essentially foreclose on that garage. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Energy Secretary Chris Wright have been clear. The U.S. is going to market Venezuelan crude indefinitely. They've already started moving an initial 30 to 50 million barrels of sanctioned oil that was sitting in storage. But the catch is the money. It's going into U.S.-controlled accounts to be disbursed for humanitarian aid and infrastructure. This is a massive shift. For decades, the U.S. has been at the mercy of the Middle East and the whims of OPEC+. If the U.S. can control the taps in Venezuela, it creates a massive buffer. It's about energy security, sure, but it's also about leverage. Now, let's talk about the biggest loser in this 2026 scenario, China. Before this month, China was Venezuela's primary lifeline. They were taking about 600,000 barrels a day, often at a steep discount. This was a loans-for-oil deal that kept Maduro afloat while giving China a secure, non-U.S. controlled energy source. But on January 7th, the U.S. Navy seized 2 oil tankers, one of which was flying a Russian flag. This was a message. China loses its exclusive, discounted back channel. Trump says he has a great relationship with President Xi and that China will still get oil, but the terms have changed. They'll have to buy it at market rates through U.S.-approved channels. This isn't just about oil. It's about who holds the leash on the global supply chain. If the U.S. can redirect those barrels, it changes the power dynamic in the Pacific just as much as it does in the Caribbean. So, Trump says big oil is going to invest $100 billion. He's meeting with the heads of Exxon, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips at the White House right now. It sounds like a modern-day gold rush, but if you're an oil executive, you're cautious. The reality on the ground in Venezuela is rough. We're talking about pipelines that haven't been maintained in a decade, power grids that flicker out every day, and massive upgraders, facilities that turn thick, tar-like oil into something you can ship, that are currently broken. Analysts say that even with a blank check, it will take 1 to 2 years just to get production back up by 500,000 barrels. To get back to the 3 million barrels a day they were doing 20 years ago, that's a 10 to 15-year project costing upwards of $183 billion. And then there's the trust factor. Companies like Exxon were burned in 2007 when their assets were seized by the state. They need institutional stability. They need to know that if the political wind shifts, their $20 billion investment isn't going to be nationalized again. Trump has suggested the U.S. government might provide insurance or reimbursements if things go south, which is a wild concept. It shows just how much this is being treated as a national security mission rather than a simple business deal. Let's get into the technical side, because this is why your wallet cares. Venezuela produces heavy crude. Most oil in the U.S., Texas shale, is light, sweet crude. However, the massive refineries on the U.S. Gulf Coast were actually built specifically to process this heavy Venezuelan oil. For the last few years, these refineries in Louisiana and Texas have had to buy expensive blends from the Middle East. If the heavy stuff starts flowing from Venezuela to the Gulf again, those refineries become much more efficient. Efficiency usually means lower costs for gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. More importantly, it puts a permanent cap on how high oil prices can go. If OPEC Plus tries to cut production to raise prices, the U.S. can just turn the dial up in Venezuela. It's a total reshaping of the price maker versus price taker dynamic. We are moving toward a Western Hemisphere energy fortress. We also have to consider the internal logistics. Venezuela's Orinoco Belt is a geological marvel, but it's a nightmare to work with. The oil is so thick, it's basically molasses. Under Maduro, they didn't have the chemicals needed to make it flow through pipes. They had to import those from Iran. Now, the Trump administration wants to swap that out for U.S.-made light oil and chemicals. This creates a circular economy. U.S. companies sell the thinning agents to Venezuela, use the heavy oil at U.S. refineries, and sell the finished gas back to the world. It's a closed loop that keeps the profits in a very specific set of hands. Critics call this resource colonialism, while supporters say it's the only way to save a failed state. Whatever you call it, it's a massive project requiring thousands of American engineers and security personnel to work in a country that is still in flux. What about the environmental side? Venezuelan oil is dirty to extract. It requires massive amounts of steam and heat. In an era of ESG goals, a $100 billion investment in heavy crude feels like a step back to the 20th century. The Trump administration's stance is effectively, we care about the price and the power, not the buzzwords. They are betting that for the next 30 years, the world will still run on internal combustion. If they're right, they own the board. If they're wrong, it's a $100 billion stranded asset. Then there's the interim government situation. Delcy Rodriguez is the face of the transition, but Trump has made it clear that Energy Secretary Chris Wright and State Secretary Marco Rubio are effectively the ones managing the resource. Creditors are lining up. Everyone from Russian banks to Canadian miners has a claim for billions. Trump's plan seems to be to set aside those old debts to prioritize new investment. He's essentially saying the old debts don't count if you want to play in the new sandbox. This will lead to years of legal battles, but for a deal maker, that's just the cost of doing business. Let's look at the ripple effect on neighbors like Guyana. Guyana has been having an oil boom, but Maduro was threatening to invade them recently. By removing Maduro, the U.S. has stabilized Guyana's rigs as well. This creates a double win. Between U.S. shale, Guyana's offshore rigs, and a rebooted Venezuela, the Americas become an energy powerhouse that can ignore the Middle East. This has huge implications for NATO and Europe. If Europe can get its energy from a stable, U.S.-backed South America instead of Russia or the Persian Gulf, the geopolitical map of the 21st century changes forever. But we have to be realistic about the human touch. Venezuela is a country of 28 million people who have suffered the worst economic collapse in modern history. The oil industry isn't just a set of pipes. It's a source of jobs, food, and stability. If the U.S. fixes the oil, but the people still can't afford bread, the new government won't last. Trump has mentioned using oil revenues to fix the country, but history shows that trickle-down oil wealth often gets stuck at the top. The success won't just be measured by the price of crude, it will be measured by whether Caracas looks like a functioning city again in 5 years. There is also the Russia factor. For years, Russia helped Maduro bypass sanctions. Now, those Russian assets are in limbo. Trump has hinted he might negotiate with Putin over these assets, perhaps as part of a larger deal involving Europe. This makes oil a diplomatic chip that can be traded for peace. Additionally, the Petro-Carib program, where Venezuela gave cheap oil to Caribbean islands for political support, is dead. This leaves a vacuum that the U.S. will have to fill, likely with American energy. It's a total sweep of the backyard, removing Russian, Chinese, or Iranian influence. As we move deeper into 2026, the question, who owns the oil, is being replaced by who can get it out of the ground fastest. In a world where supply chains are fracturing, having the oil right next door is an advantage you can't overstate. The Trump administration is betting that physical control of these resources outweighs the legal and political headaches. It's a return to realpolitik, where the strongest player sets the rules. Let's touch on the technical side of the Orinoco Belt one last time. Most people don't realize this oil is extra heavy. It's not like Saudi oil that almost jumps out of the ground. It requires thermal recovery, basically cooking the ground to make the oil flow. The U.S. perfected this in the Canadian oil sands. By applying this tech to Venezuela, we could see production rates the world hasn't seen in half a century. But it takes time to move the rigs and the experts. We are looking at a massive migration of energy workers from the U.S. South to the Venezuelan coast. In the end, we're watching a high-stakes experiment in resource politics. If Trump can pull this off, if the investment flows and the transition holds, we are looking at a fundamental shift in global power. The U.S. becomes the energy manager of the Western Hemisphere. But things rarely go exactly to plan in the oil business. Legal hurdles, unpaid debts, and 270% inflation are massive roadblocks. One thing is for sure, the gold rush for Venezuelan oil is back on. Whether it leads to cheap energy or just another chapter of friction, we'll be here to track every barrel. What do you think? Is this the right move for U.S. energy security? Or is the $100 billion price tag too high for the risk? Do you think gas will actually hit that $1.50 a barrel target? Or is it just political theater? Let me know in the comments below. I actually read them and love hearing your take. Wait, before we go, we have to address the elephant in the room. The global market is currently in a supply glut. Oil is already cheap, around $55. If the U.S. successfully floods the market with another 2 million barrels for Venezuela, what happens to American oil producers in Texas and North Dakota? They need higher prices to stay profitable. This is the ultimate balancing act. Trump wants cheap gas for consumers, but he needs a profitable oil industry for donors and the economy. If he drives the price too low, he could accidentally cause an oil bust at home. It's a game of chess where the board is the entire world. Finally, consider the diplomatic side. For 20 years, Venezuela has been the anti-U.S. hub of Latin America. With that hub gone, the political landscape of the entire continent shifts. From Brazil to Colombia, every government is now looking at Washington and wondering what the new rules are. This isn't just an oil story. It's the story of a new era of American influence. We are seeing a world where energy, military power, and economics are all being fused into one single strategy. There's also the question of the day after. If Maduro is in a U.S. court, who is actually on the ground in Caracas? We are seeing reports of U.S. military police helping to secure oil terminals. This level of involvement hasn't been seen in the Americas for generations. The long-term cost of this security might not be in dollars, but in political capital. If things get messy, the $100 billion investment might be the least of our worries. But for now, the markets are reacting. Tankers are being redirected. Contracts are being written. And the $100 billion sum being discussed at the White House today is the starting gun for a race that will define the next decade of energy. Whether you're an investor, a driver, or just someone who follows the news, this is the story to watch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Like and subscribers.